Part two for the genetics lab is going to be very brief compared to the way it's done when we do it in class. If I had everybody in class, and I would have needed a pretty decent sized class. This doesn't work too well with a little bitty class like we have with the splits this semester, and the fact that a whole bunch of you people are not showing up. I'm not a little bit frustrated by that, am I? But what we typically would do was I would give you a chart of dominant recessive human traits. Can you do that? What color eyes do you have? How are your ears attached to your face? Do you have a widow's peak up here? And you would have gone out and surveyed a bunch of family members, or at least a bunch of people, if you couldn't find people related to you. And we would use those charts to, I would compile a big massive chart of the different traits that people would have. And going in, everybody would expect the dominant traits to be more common because we just looked at all the different combinations, and the dominant show up way more in the kids than the recessives do. But what this all would have shown them is sometimes the recessives are actually the more common trait, right? If you were to walk around the streets of Stockholm, Sweden, you'd see an awful lot of blue-eyed people. That doesn't mean that blue eyes are magically dominant in Sweden. It means that there's not a lot of brown alleles in a Swedish population of alleles. And that's the way that the real world works, is that a population of people is also a gene pool, a population of alleles. And if a recessive allele is rare, then you're not going to see it very much. If a recessive allele is really common, it's going to show up a heck of a lot of the time, more than you would expect thinking the dominant was going to cover it. And this was all building toward the end of the of part two, and the question that's the only question you're getting from part two. If you know what's dominant and recessive, and you want to predict its, how often this trait or that trait occurs in a population, then what's the other thing you need to know? And the answer for this, and you're writing this down as you go along, right? How do I know before I go to Stockholm how many brown-eyed people I'm going to see if I count 1,000 people? Well, if you could tell me how common brown alleles are in the Swedish gene pool, well, I can take a pretty good guess for how many brown-eyed people I'm going to see, right? It's 5% of the Swedish gene pool, and I'm counting 1,000 people, then somewhere around 50 people I'm going to run into at brown eyes, because you only need one brown allele to have brown eyes in that population. If I was going to, say, Jakarta, Indonesia, and you were to tell me, well, in Indonesia, 95% of the alleles in that gene pool are brown. I'm going to go count 1,000 people. How many people am I going to see with blue eyes? Well, in order to have blue eyes, you need two blues together. You're only 5% of the population. You're not going to see that very often. You might count, I haven't done the odds. I would be surprised if it rose to the level of even 5 people. But it's going to be much more rare because you aren't going to see it with just one allele the way that you do with brown eyes in a Swedish population. You got to get 2 alleles together. And if there's only 1 out of every 20 alleles is blue, then you're not going to see 2 of them together very often. You see this in African American populations in the United States, where there was a lot of stuff done that was not too great during that period of time, and so there's a lot of European alleles in the African American population. So you do get blue-eyed African Americans, and the parents may be brown-eyed and the grandparents may be brown-eyed, but those blue alleles are in there, and you're needing to get 2 of them together. This is one of those times where people, they think they know the rules of genetics, and they go, who have you been fooling around with? We have this blue-eyed kid. It happens. It all depends on how common in the population it is. So this is a very short video because it's only one question for part 2.